Imagine standing in a frigid stone chamber, your bare skin prickling not just from the February chill seeping through the ancient walls of ruined castle, but from the piercing dread of scrutiny. You're 14 years old, Blanche of Navarre, trembling under the gaze of the Duchess of Bedford and two midwives whose weathered hands probe your body as if you were livestock of market. One wrong word from them, one claim that your hymen is not intact, and your future as a potential queen crumbles into disgrace, exile, or worse, death. This isn't just a medical examination. It's a tribunal where your worth, your honor, and your life hang in the balance. The year is 1453 AD, and after 13 years of marriage to Henry IV of Castile, a marriage that remained unconsummated, Blanche, now 29, faces this humiliating ritual to prove what her body has endured in silence. 13 years of sharing a bed with a man who never touched her. 13 years of whispers questioning her worth, her fertility, or his manhood. 13 years of a royal facade masking private shame. Before we unravel these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, let's connect across time to our shared curiosity about the past. If these hidden truths of history captivate you, hit that like button, subscribe for more, and drop a comment below to share where you're listening from. It's remarkable how these ancient tales unite us, from bustling modern cities to quiet corners of the world, all bound by a hunger to understand the lives that shaped our history. Blanche's ordeal wasn't hers alone. In the shadowed corridors of medieval power, every woman destined for a crown, or clinging to one, faced a chilling reality. Their bodies were not their own. They were commodities inspected and validated by the very men who claimed to protect them. Medieval Europe was a world forged in bloodlines and breeding, where virginity wasn't just a personal virtue, but a political currency. Why? Because in an era where inheritance determined the fate of kingdoms, a woman's hymen was the ultimate seal of authenticity. A virgin bride was the only way to ensure a child's paternity, securing a lineage that could stabilize or topple dynasties. This obsession with purity wasn't abstract. It was brutally physical. Royal women like Blanche were subjected to examinations that stripped away dignity under the guise of necessity. The process was methodical, public, and often performed in cold, stone-walled chambers designed to amplify vulnerability. Midwives, sometimes joined by physicians or noble women, would inspect a woman's body, searching for signs of an intact hymen, while witnesses, often male, stood by to ensure the findings were legitimate. The stakes were astronomical. A confirmed virgin might secure a marriage alliance, strengthening ties between kingdoms. A failed test could mean ruin, not just for the woman, but for entire political networks. To understand Blanche's world, picture a society where every royal marriage was a high-stakes gamble. In 1440, when Blanche wed Henry at age 16, her union was meant to solidify Navarre's ties with Castile. Yet, for reasons lost to history, speculated to be Henry's impotence, political maneuvering, or mutual disinterest, the marriage remained unconsummated. By 1453, with no heir and mounting pressure, the court demanded proof of Blanche's virginity to annul the marriage without sparking a diplomatic crisis. The examination was not just about her body. It was about preserving the fragile balance of power in a Europe torn by wars and rivalries. The 100 Years' War still smoldered, and Castile's alliances were critical. Blanche's body became a battleground for political legitimacy, her private shame a matter of public record. The cultural weight of virginity in this era can't be overstated. Medieval society viewed a woman's purity as a reflection of her moral and spiritual worth, a belief rooted in Christian teachings that exalted chastity while demonizing female sexuality. Sermons and texts like the Secretus Mulierum reinforced the idea that a woman's body held secrets only men could decipher. Yet, this fixation wasn't just religious, it was economic. A royal bride virginity guaranteed that any child she bore would inherit vast estates, titles, or even crowns without dispute. For Blanche, the examination was a test of her value as a political asset, not as a person. Her youth, her dreams, her fears, none of these mattered in the face of dynastic necessity. Adding to the cruelty, these examinations were often public spectacles. Court records from the period describe noble women stripped naked before witnesses, their bodies scrutinized as if they were legal documents. The Duchess of Bedford, overseeing Blanche's examination, wasn't just a bystander. She was a gatekeeper of power, ensuring the results aligned with Castile's political needs. The midwives, though women themselves, were complicit in a system that pitted them against their own sex, their loyalty bought by status or survival. For Blanche, the cold hands probing her were not just invasive. They were a reminder that her body belonged to the crown, not to her. The emotional toll was devastating. Imagine the shame of standing exposed, knowing that your worth hinges on a fragile membrane that could be torn by something as innocent as horseback riding. Medieval medical ignorance meant that natural variations in anatomy were often misread as evidence of sin. Blanche, at 29, had endured a childless marriage, court gossip, and now this final indignity. Yet, her story is a window into a broader truth. Every royal woman faced the scrutiny. From queens to princesses, their bodies were battlegrounds where personal dignity was a sacrifice for political gain. In the coming parts, we'll explore the bizarre and brutal methods used to test virginity, the women who resisted, and the lasting scars of a system that reduced humanity to flesh. The methods devised to verify virginity in medieval Europe were as varied as they were violating, blending crude physical inspections with superstitious rituals that masqueraded as science. At the heart of it all was a most direct approach, inspecting the hymen, that thin membrane mythologized as a guardian of purity. Midwives or physicians would probe intimately, often in front of witnesses, declaring a woman virgo intacta only if it appeared unbroken. But this was no gentle check. It was invasive, painful, and unreliable, ignoring that hymens could tear from riding horses, dancing, or even daily chores. Facts dismissed in favor of patriarchal certainty. Medieval minds, steeped in a mix of Christian doctrine and lingering pagan folklore, weren't content with mere anatomy. They concocted elaborate, degrading tests rooted in superstition, desperation, and profound mistrust of women, turning the female body into a riddle to be solved by absurd means. Consider the sieve test, a ritual so outlandish it borders on farce, yet inflicted real terror on countless women. Drawn from ancient legends where saints or mythical virgins performed miracles, like the tale of Tuccia, a Roman Vestal virgin, who carried water in a sieve to prove her chastity. This method was adapted into a cruel medieval ordeal. A woman was handed a common kitchen sieve and commanded to hold water in it. If, by some impossible grace attributed to her purity, the water didn't leak, she was deemed a virgin. A leaky sieve, however, equated to a leaky body, symbolizing lost virtue and a sullied soul. Imagine noble daughters, clad in fine silks or stripped to heighten vulnerability, standing before leering crowds of male courtiers and clergy, their hands shaking as they desperately tried to contain the inevitable drip. The humiliation wasn't accidental. It was a public spectacle designed to reinforce women's subjugation, echoing biblical and classical motifs where purity granted supernatural powers. Even more peculiar and no less degrading were the urine tests, which treated women's bodily fluids as oracles of morality. Medieval physicians, drawing from pseudo-medical texts influenced by Arabic and Greek traditions, approached this with the solemnity of alchemists. The 13th century treatise De Secretis Mulierum, on the secrets of women, falsely attributed to Albertus Magnus, but likely penned by his followers, proclaimed that a virgin's urine was clear and lucid, sometimes white, sometimes sparkling, like a pristine stream reflecting divine light. Another authority suggested observing the act itself. A virgin supposedly urinated with a subtle hiss, taking longer than a small boy, as if virtue slowed the flow. These ideas stem from humoral theory, where bodily fluids revealed inner states, but in practice, they reduced royal women to performing animals. Picture a princess, her cheeks burning with shame, forced to relieve herself into a chamber pot under the watchful eyes and ears of male doctors who leaned in, listening for virtue in the trickle. The degradation was calculated, embedding the notion that women's essence could be quantified, their secrets exposed through something as mundane as piss. This wasn't just medical. It was a ritual of control, blending Galen's ancient physiology with Christian suspicions of female deceit. Some tests veered into the occult, revealing the era's blend of science and sorcery. The 14th century writer John of Treviso, in his translation of Bartholomeus Anglicus's De Proprietatibus Rerum, described a magnet test not strictly for virginity, but for fidelity, yet it was adapted to question a bride's past. A lodestone placed under a chaste wife's pillow would draw her to embrace her husband in sleep. If adulterous, she'd bolt from the bed, tormented by visions. This drew from natural philosophy's fascination with magnets, sympathetic powers, seen as divine indicators of harmony or discord. But it turned bedtime into a trial, exploiting fears of supernatural judgment. But perhaps the most horrifying were the fumigation tests, a barbaric fusion of medicine and torture. The 15th century Italian physician Niccolò Falcucci, in his Sermons Medici, prescribed covering a woman with cloth and fumigating her with the finest coal or aromatic substances. A virgin, he claimed, wouldn't smell the odor through her mouth or nose, her sealed body impervious. A non-virgin would inhale it, proving her openness. Inspired by earlier Arabic medical texts like those of Avicenna, which explored vapors and porosity, this method essentially smoked women like preserved meat, watching for coughs or retches amid toxic fumes that could cause real harm, dizziness, burns, or poisoning. The cultural roots trace back to ancient purification rites, but in medieval courts, it became a tool of terror, the acrid smoke a metaphor for the burning scrutiny women endured. These tests weren't isolated quirks. They proliferated across Europe, from French chateaus to Italian palaces, fueled by a society where alchemy and astrology informed medicine, and women's bodies were experimental grounds for proving patriarchal order. In enhancing these accounts, we see not just cruelty, but a web of influences. Roman myths, Islamic scholarship transmitted via translations, and Christian emphasis on bodily integrity. Yet, the absurdity masked a deeper purpose, to instill fear and obedience, ensuring every woman knew her purity was provisional, subject to whims of power. As we delve further, the roles of those who enforce these rituals come into sharper, more tragic focus. The women who wielded the tools of examination, midwives, noble ladies, and occasionally physicians, were often cast as reluctant participants in a theater of cruelty, yet their roles revealed a fractured sisterhood of medieval society. These examiners, predominantly women themselves, should have been allies in a world stacked against their gender, bound by shared experiences of subjugation. Instead, many became instruments of the very oppression that ensnared them all. Midwives, with their intimate knowledge of female anatomy gained from birth and ailments, were trusted to perform the most invasive probes, declaring a woman virgo intacta or condemning her with a single observation. Some, in rare displays of solidarity, bent the truth to protect a fellow woman, perhaps recalling their own vulnerabilities or moved by pity. But most adhered strictly to honesty, their findings hurling sisters on the proverbial medieval bus, as the weight of patriarchal expectations crushed any impulse toward mercy. Why this betrayal among women? The answer pulses through the suffocating veins of medieval culture, where the thumb oppression was so immense, so woven into the fabric of daily life, that females internalized the rhetoric branding them as wicked, untrustworthy, inferior, and dishonest. From childhood, girls were steeped in sermons and folklore that portrayed Eve as the original deceiver, her descendants forever suspect. Texts like the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer Witches, though later in the 15th century, echoed earlier sentiments by reinforcing women's supposed propensity for sin, making midwives complicit in a system that promised them scraps of authority in exchange for enforcing purity. Societal pressures were unrelenting. A midwife who falsified results risked her livelihood, social ostracism, or even accusations of witchcraft, especially in an era when the Inquisition loomed. In cultures like Byzantine or Islamic-influenced regions of Europe, where similar examinations occurred, midwives navigated honor codes that valued collective reputation over individual empathy, drawing from ancient Greek medical traditions in Hippocratic texts that objectified the female body as a vessel to be inspected. The stakes for failing a virginity test transcended personal shame, plunging into realms of mortal peril and political upheaval. In some societies, such as those under strict Islamic or tribal influences in medieval Spain or Italy, failure could invite public execution, stoning, beheading, or burning to restore family honor. More commonly in Christian Europe, it meant exile, abandonment to beggary, or confinement in convents, where a woman's impurity rendered her unfit for society. For royal women, the repercussions rippled outward, igniting international fires. A questioned virgin could shatter alliances forged through marriage treaties, as seen in the annals of the Holy Roman Empire, where dowries and territories hung on bodily proof. Imagine a princess from France betrothed to an English lord. A failed test might nullify the union, provoking border skirmishes or full-scale wars, as kings invoked divine right to reclaim lost honor. Medieval texts abound with such tales. The Gesta Romanorum, a 13th to 14th century collection of moralized stories, includes anecdotes of virgins tested and punished, underscoring how purity failures symbolize broader moral decay, justifying severe reprisals. Expanding on these cultural examples, consider the Trotula, a 12th century compendium on women's medicine from Salerno, Italy, which, while offering remedies, tacitly acknowledged the prevalence of examinations by providing advice on restoring apparent virginity, hints at the desperation bred by fear. In Scandinavian sagas or Celtic lore, adapted into medieval chronicles, virginity tests intertwine with mythic elements, like trials by ordeal where failure meant not just disgrace but supernatural curses, reflecting a blend of pagan holdovers and Christian absolutism. Politically, these tests were weapons in dynastic arsenals. A rival faction might demand an examination to discredit a queen, as in the case of false accusations against Eleanor of Aquitaine, whose rumored infidelities fueled court intrigues without formal tests but under similar scrutiny. The emotional layering here is profound. Women faced not only physical invasion, but the knowledge that their bodies could topple thrones, their private integrity a public commodity in a chess game of power. These examinations, then, were more than medical rituals. They were cogs in a machine of control, where midwives' hands, though gentle in birthing rooms, became enforcers in chambers of judgment. As we turn specific royal ordeals, the story of Catherine of Aragon illuminates how these tests evolved into battlegrounds of faith, politics, and unyielding pride. Catherine of Aragon's ordeal stands as a stark emblem of how virginity tests transcended personal violation to become weapons in the arsenals of political warfare, where a woman's body was dissected not just by hands, but by the ambitions of kings and courts. In the 1520s, as Henry VIII maneuvered to annul their marriage, Catherine found her most intimate history dragged into the unforgiving light of public scrutiny. She insisted until her last breath that she had come to Henry's bed a virgin, her brief first marriage to his brother Arthur unconsummated due to his youth and illness. Yet Henry, desperate for a male heir and enamored with Boleyn, twisted scripture and testimony to argue otherwise, claiming their union violated divine law, as outlined in Leviticus. What began as a private matter erupted into an international spectacle, with theologians, lawyers, and diplomats poring over the details of her wedding nights, caring nothing for her dignity and everything for the power plays at stake. The examination process for Catherine wasn't a single event, but a prolonged siege on her integrity, echoing the methodical torture reserved for royal women. Though no new physical inspection occurred, relying instead on recollections and sworn statements, her body was effectively laid bare through relentless questioning. Court records describe how witnesses from her early years in England were summoned to recount the state of her marriage bed with Arthur, debating bloodstains, conversations, and behaviors as if they were battlefield strategies. Henry needed to prove consummation to validate his annulment case, a task complicated by Catherine's unyielding testimony and initial accounts that supported her claim. The irony burned. The same body once approved for royal union now fueled a schism that would birth the Church of England. Politically, this was a mere divorce. It was a seismic shift challenging papal authority and redrawing alliances across Europe. Enhancing the emotional depth, Catherine's resilience shines through like a beacon in a storm-tossed sea. A proud Spanish princess, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, the conquerors who unified Spain and funded Columbus. She arrived in England at 15, a pawn in the intricate web of Habsburg Tudor diplomacy. Her dowry was immense. 200,000 crowns, plates of gold, and promises of trade that bolstered England's coffers. Yet, widowed at 16 after Arthur's death for what historians suspect was tuberculosis or the sweating sickness, she spent 7 years in limbo, her virginity a diplomatic bargaining chip. When she married Henry in 1509, both affirmed her purity, with Henry later boasting of finding her a true maid. But by the 1520s, with only one surviving daughter, Mary, and Henry's eye wandering, that affirmation curdled into accusation. Catherine's letters reveal a woman of fierce faith and intellect, debating scholars in Latin, enduring isolation and demotion to dowager princess while clinging to her queenship. Her trauma wasn't just physical memory, but psychological warfare. House arrest, separation from her daughter, and the knowledge that her body's history could orphan her child politically. The international stakes amplified the horror. Spain, under her nephew Emperor Charles V, pressured the Pope to deny the annulment, while France watched gleefully as England fractured. The king's great matter consumed Europe, with envoys shuttling between London, Rome, and Madrid, dissecting Catherine's nights with Arthur. Did they share a bed? Was there intimacy amid his frailty? Papal legates like Cardinal Campeggio held hearings where maids testified to unchanged sheets, yet Henry countered with claims of her non-virgin state based on physical tokens. This scrutiny wasn't abstract. It was a violation replayed in courtrooms, her most vulnerable moments commodified for geopolitical gain. The emotional toll manifested in Catherine's declining health, her steadfast Catholicism a shield against despair, as she wrote to Henry, "My heart is yours," even as he stripped her titles. Catherine's story underscores a hymen's fragility not just biologically, but symbolically. Torn by politics as easily as by accident, her defiance, refusing to enter a convent or concede, forced Henry to break with Rome in 1533, birthing Anglicanism and reshaping history. Yet for Catherine, dying in 1536, it was a Pyrrhic stand, honored as queen in death by supporters, but buried modestly, her legacy a testament to enduring with grace amid betrayal. As we pivot to another icon of resilience, Joan of Arc's examinations reveal how virginity intertwined with divine claims, her body a canvas for theological debates. Joan of Arc's virginity tests were not mere physical inspections. They were theological gauntlets, where her body became a battleground for proving divine favor in a world that equated purity with godliness. In 1431, as she faced trial for heresy, the 19-year-old peasant-turned-warrior endured multiple examinations to verify her chastity, each probing not just her flesh, but her claim to hear God's voice. The medieval mind, steeped in Christian doctrine, held that only a virgin could be a true vessel for divine revelation, untainted by the devil's influence. For Joan, who led French armies to victory against the English at Orleans and inspired a nation, her spiritual authority hinged on a fragile membrane. Her courage on the battlefield, her visions of saints, her audacity to dress as a man, all were secondary to the state of her hymen, scrutinized to affirm or deny her as France's prophesied savior. The first examination, conducted sometime before January 13, 1431, was overseen by the Duchess of Bedford in Rouen, the English stronghold where Joan was imprisoned. Stripped naked, she lay exposed as midwives and noble women searched for signs of sexual activity, their findings recorded with clinical precision. A second, private probe by two women confirmed her virginity, followed by yet another in Tours, orchestrated by Charles Vill's mother-in-law, Yolande of Aragon, to certify Joan as the virgin foretold to deliver France. These tests weren't just about her body. They were theological litmus tests, rooted in a worldview where Satan could not inhabit a pure maiden. The Vitae Sanctarum, a collection of saints' lives, reinforced this, portraying virgin martyrs like Saint Agnes as shielded from evil by their chastity. Joan's examiners, steeped in such texts, saw her body as evidence of her sanctity or her heresy. The irony was crushing. Joan, who donned armor, rallied troops, and turned the tide of the 100 Years' War, was reduced to a specimen on a table, her divine mission subject to human hands. Medieval Christianity, drawing from Augustine and Jerome, preached that women's spiritual worth was tied to physical purity, a doctrine that turned Joan's body into a theological text. Her trial records, preserved in the process to condemnation, detail how English clerics, desperate to discredit her, used these tests to undermine her visions. If she wasn't a virgin, they argued, her voices were demonic, her victories unholy. Yet Joan's defiance shone through. She declared her virginity was an oath to God, both of body and soul, a vow she kept even as chains bound her wrists. Her examiners, expecting a trembling girl, found a warrior who stared back unyielding, her faith a shield against their probes. Expanding on this, Joan's ordeal reflected a broader medieval paradox. Women could wield extraordinary influence, leading armies, advising kings, but only if their bodies passed muster. The speculum virginum, a 12th century guide for nuns, taught that virginity was a state of divine election, yet required earthly proof. Joan's tests, conducted in cold chambers with witnesses like the Bishop of Beauvais, were public spectacles meant to break her spirit. The emotional toll was immense. Trial testimonies hint at her stoic silence during examinations, a contrast to her fiery retorts in theological debates. Culturally, her story echoed virgin savior myths, like the Sibyl of the Cumean prophecies, adapted into Christian lore to frame women as vessels of divine will, provided they remained sealed. Her repeated examinations, spaced across months, were strategic, designed to wear her down, each touch a reminder that her body belonged to the state and church, not herself. Joan's resilience carried her through, but at a cost. Burned at the stake in 1431, she faced death with the same conviction that sustained her through invasive probes. Her virginity, confirmed repeatedly, became a double-edged sword. It validated her mission for the French, but couldn't save her from English flames. Her story reveals a world where divine revelation required physical verification, where a woman's worth, whether queen or prophet, was measured by her body's compliance with male authority. As we turn to ways women fought back, the ingenuity and desperation of their resistance illuminate the cracks in this oppressive system. In the face of invasive virginity tests, medieval women displayed remarkable ingenuity, weaving a covert tapestry of resistance that turned desperation into defiance. These acts of subterfuge were not mere tricks, but survival strategies, born from the terror of consequences that ranged from public disgrace to execution. The Trotula, that 12th century compendium from Salerno, whispered secrets of deception, offering methods to fake virginity for women trapped by scrutiny. One chilling technique involved placing a leech on the labia of the day before a wedding, carefully positioned to avoid slipping inside, letting it draw blood to form a crust that mimicked an intact hymen. The pain was excruciating, the risk of infection high. Yet for many, it was a lesser evil than failing the test. This method, rooted in folk medicine and the era's limited understanding of biology, reveals the lengths women went to protect their futures in a world that commodified their bodies. Another tactic was the use of animal blood, a sleight of hand as old as the rituals themselves. Medieval households, often adjacent to farms, provided easy access to chicken or pig blood, which a bride could conceal in jewelry or a vial and spill onto the sheets in the dark of the wedding night. This deception, drawn from oral traditions and later documented in texts like the Secreta Mulierum, required meticulous planning, smearing blood under cover of intimacy, all while feigning innocence before prying servants. The Trotula also suggested a constricted paste of egg whites, pennyroyal, and hot herbs, applied vaginally to tighten tissues and mimic virginity. Such recipes, blending herbal knowledge with desperation, reflect a grim alchemy where women became their own apothecaries, risking irritation or worse to pass inspection. These acts were not just practical. They were rebellions, small but seismic, against a system that demanded their bodies conform to impossible standards. The wedding night itself was a stage for these performances, where the pressure to produce blood transformed intimacy into a public trial. Across Europe, from Castilian courts to Armenian villages, the display of bloody sheets was a ritual of proof, sometimes paraded before guests or sent to foreign allies as evidence of consummation. In Armenia, the red apple ceremony celebrated a bride's virginity with bloody cloth, a tradition echoed in Georgian Azerbaijani communities with their blood ceremony. These customs, rooted in Indo-European fertility rites and reinforced by Christian purity ideals, ignored biological realities. Hymens might not bleed, even in virgins, due to natural variation or prior activity like horseback riding. Yet, the absence of blood could doom a bride, branding her as spoiled regardless of truth. Women countered with cunning. Some timed weddings to coincide with menstruation. Others substituted another woman for the consummation, a risky ruse requiring conspiratorial allies. These deceptions carried profound cultural weight, echoing resistance in other patriarchal societies. In ancient Mesopotamia, texts like the Code of Hammurabi hint at similar blood-proof expectations, while in medieval Islamic courts, midwives used comparable tricks to protect women from honor killings. The emotional toll was staggering. Women who resorted to leeches or blood vials lived with a constant fear of discovery, their relief at passing tempered by the trauma of self-inflicted wounds. Court records, like those from 14th century Aragon, describe brides caught in such deceptions facing flogging or exile. Yet the persistence of these methods speaks to a shared, whispered network of knowledge. Women pass these secrets through generations, from mothers to daughters, maids to mistresses, creating an underground resistance that defied the prying eyes of midwives and lords. The unreliability of these tests, acknowledged even by some medieval physicians, only deepened the tragedy. The Canon of Medicine by Avicenna, influential in Europe, noted that hymen variations were natural, yet courts ignored such wisdom, favoring control over truth. Women's ingenuity, born of necessity, carved out fragile spaces of agency in a world that sought to strip it away. As we explore the deeper purpose of these tests, we uncover a system designed not for accuracy, but for domination, leaving lasting scars on those who endured it. The true purpose of virginity tests in medieval Europe was never about uncovering truth. It was about control, a calculated mechanism to ensure women, no matter their rank, remained tethered to the whims of male authority. These rituals, cloaked in the guise of medical necessity or divine mandate, were designed to reinforce a hierarchy where women's bodies were state property, their worth measured by compliance. The psychological scars left by these examinations were profound, etching shame, fear, and alienation into the lives of those who endured them. For Blanche of Navarre, her successful virginity test in 1453, after 13 years of an unconsummated marriage to Henry IV of Castile, was no triumph. It was a hollow victory, costing her youth, dignity, and dreams of fulfilling marriage. Sent back to Navarre, she was discarded, her value as a political pawn exhausted by the very test meant to affirm her honor. The examination process itself was a study in methodical degradation. Royal women were stripped naked in cold, sparsely furnished chambers, their bodies laid out on tables like cadavers for dissection. Multiple witnesses, nobles, clergy, sometimes even rival courtiers, observe as midwives or physicians probe with cold fingers or crude instruments, searching for a hymen that could be absent or torn through no fault of the woman. Medical ignorance compounded the cruelty. Physicians, guided by texts like the Secretus Mulierum, often mistook natural anatomical variations for evidence of sin. A hymen could rupture from riding, dancing, or even childbirth-related tasks, yet medieval courts saw only impurity, ignoring biological realities in favor of dogma. The Hippocratic corpus, still influential, offered little clarity on female anatomy, leaving examiners to rely on superstition over science, their expertise a veneer for enforcing patriarchal order. The aftermath was as punishing as the act. Women reported feelings of violation that lingered like a bruise, their sense of self fractured by the knowledge that their most private moments were public record. Court chronicles from the period, such as those from the Castilian court, describe women's reactions. Some wept silently, others froze in stoic detachment, as their bodies were discussed like legal exhibits. The psychological warfare was intentional. The threat of future tests kept women in a state of perpetual anxiety, policing their own actions to avoid activities that might damage their perceived purity. This fear reshaped their lives, from avoiding strenuous tasks to suppressing natural expressions of autonomy, turning their bodies into prisons they could never escape. Blanche's ordeal exemplifies this trauma. At 29, she stood naked before the Duchess of Bedford and midwives, her body a ledger of her failed marriage's political stakes. The examination confirmed her virginity, but the victory was Pyrrhic. It marked the end of her role in Castile, her return to Navarre a quiet exile. The emotional weight of those 13 years, whispers of her barrenness, Henry's indifference, and the final indignity of proving her untouched state, left scars no court could record. Expanding on this, medieval medical texts like the Trotula reveal a grim awareness among practitioners that these tests were unreliable, yet their use persisted because they served a deeper economic purpose. Midwives and physicians were well compensated, their livelihoods tied to upholding the system. Royal courts budgeted for these rituals, with records from 15th century France showing payments to examiners equivalent to a knight's ransom, ensuring their complicity in a profitable cycle of oppression. The economic incentives were matched by cultural reinforcement. Sermons and literature, like the Gesta Romanorum, framed virginity as a sacred duty, making resistance seem sacrilegious. Yet the test's true aim was to remind women of their place. Subject to scrutiny at any moment, their bodies never truly their own. The damage wasn't just personal. It rippled through families and kingdoms, as failed tests could unravel alliances or bankrupt dowries. Blanche's examination, documented in Castilian archives, was less about her honor than about clearing Henry for a new marriage, her body a footnote in dynastic ledgers. As we delve into the broader systems, documentation, religion, and art that propped up these tests, we see how deeply they were woven into the fabric of medieval power. The machinery of virginity testing in medieval Europe was not just a series of degrading rituals, but a meticulously documented system, propped up by religious dogma, artistic glorification, and legal frameworks that turned women's bodies into public property. Every examination was recorded with clinical precision, transforming private shame into historical artifacts preserved in court archives. Scribes detailed the condition of hymens, the appearance of genitals, and even the demeanor of the women under scrutiny, creating records that could haunt them for decades. For instance, the trial records of Joan of Arc, preserved in the process to condemnation, include stark accounts of her virginity tests, written by men who saw no contradiction between venerating her divine visions and treating her body as legal evidence. These documents, stored in royal libraries across France and England, ensured that a woman's humiliation echoed through time, referenced in disputes long after her death. Religious justifications twisted the knife deeper, cloaking violation in spiritual necessity. Medieval Christianity preached the body as a temple of the Holy Spirit, yet treated women's bodies as crime scenes to be investigated. Theologians like Thomas Aquinas argued that virginity was a state of divine purity, drawing from Pauline epistles that exalted chastity as a path to God. Yet, this sanctity was weaponized. Joan of Arc's own words, recorded in her trial, show her qualifying her salvation with a vow to keep her virginity of body and soul, a belief that her spiritual worth hinged on physical intactness. The Church, which should have protected human dignity, instead orchestrated its violation, demanding physical proof of God's favor. This paradox was evident in texts like the Speculum Virginum, which framed virginity as a sacred contract requiring earthly verification, turning women's bodies into theological battlegrounds where divine grace was measured by human hands. Art and literature further normalized this abuse, embedding it in the cultural psyche. Paintings and tapestries, like the 1579 portrait of Elizabeth I holding a sieve, symbolizing her virgin queen status, or Cesare Ripa's 1611 woodcut of chastity, clutching a sieve while fending off Cupid, celebrated purity tests as noble endeavors. These works, displayed in courts and churches, romanticized a violation, presenting it as a necessary rite of moral order. Medieval romances and moral tales, such as those in the Gesta Romanorum, often depicted virgins undergoing trials to prove their worth, reinforcing the idea that such scrutiny was heroic rather than horrific. These cultural artifacts, blending Christian iconography with classical motifs like the Vestal Virgins, desensitized society to the trauma, making the examination room a stage for public virtue rather than private torment. Legally, virginity tests were enshrined in frameworks that treated women's bodies as state resources. Courts across Europe, from Castile to the Holy Roman Empire, developed detailed procedures for conducting examinations, evaluating evidence, and meting out punishments. Legal treatises, like those by 14th century jurist Bartolus of Sacroferrato, outlined the proper methods for verifying virginity, debating the reliability of hymen inspections versus witness testimonies. These laws weren't about justice but control, ensuring women remained pawns in dynastic games. The tests doubled as political weapons. Accusations of lost virginity could discredit rivals or justify annulments, as seen in Henry VIII's campaign against Catherine of Aragon, initially accepting her virginity. Henry later claimed her prior marriage to Arthur invalidated their union, a contradiction showing how tests were applied selectively to serve power. Such accusations could destabilize alliances, as when a failed test in a French-German marriage pact in 1396 sparked a diplomatic crisis, delaying peace treaties and costing thousands in reparations. The psychological warfare was deliberate, the threat of examination a constant shadow over noble women's lives. Courts cultivated paranoia, with women like Catherine monitoring their bodies obsessively, avoiding activities like writing that might compromise their hymens. Wedding nights, meant for intimacy, became performances, with couples staging bloodstains using animal blood or timed menstruation, knowing servants would inspect the sheets. These rituals, documented in chronicles like those of Froissart, turned love into strategy, with courtiers gathering to gossip over results. The system's reach extended internationally, with courts sharing techniques through diplomatic channels, creating a network of oppression that trapped women across borders. As we explore the infrastructure, training, tools, and resistance that sustained the system, the depth of its cruelty and the resilience of its victims come into sharper focus. The machinery of virginity testing was not only a spectacle of humiliation, but a bureaucratic institution, supported by specialized training, purpose-built instruments, and a chilling complicity that permeated medieval society. Midwives and physicians were not merely participants. They were trained professionals, schooled in manuals that treated the violation of women's bodies as a technical skill. Texts like the Trotula and later works, such as Niccolò Falcucci's Sermons Medici, provided detailed instructions on probing hymens, identifying signs of virginity, and documenting findings with precision. These manuals, circulated in medical schools like Salerno and Bologna, taught examiners to suppress empathy, framing their work as a moral and political necessity. The training was rigorous. Midwives learned to distinguish natural anatomical variations from supposed evidence of impurity, though their methods were rooted in ignorance, mistaking normal physiology for moral failing. This professionalization created a class of enforcers whose livelihoods depended on perpetuating abuse, their expertise a perverse blend of medical pretense and patriarchal loyalty. The tools of the trade were equally grotesque, designed with the same care as surgical instruments, but serving no healing purpose. Physicians crafted speculums and probes, some inspired by Arabic medical texts like Avicenna's Canon of Medicine, to measure hymen tissue or detect openness. These instruments, often cold metal or rough wood, were wielded with clinical detachment in stone chambers, amplifying a victim's sense of objectification. Court records from 15th century France describe payments for custom tools, costing as much as a craftsman's yearly wage, showing the economic investment in perfecting violation. These innovations, new forceps, calibrated probes, were celebrated as advances, yet they were weapons of control, disguised as science, ensuring examinations were thorough and undeniable. Society's complicity was systemic, rooted in economic incentives and cultural normalization. Midwives earned substantial fees, as seen in Castilian ledgers paying examiners the equivalent of a knight's armor, while court officials who arranged tests gained favor and promotions. This financial web ensured silence. To question the system was to risk ruin. Sermons, like those by Bernardino of Siena, preached female purity as a divine mandate, while chronicles like Froissart's normalized examinations as courtly routine. Women were conditioned to accept their violation as duty, with resistance branded as defiance of God and King. The Malleus Maleficarum later codified this, linking female sexuality to witchcraft, making compliance a matter of survival in an era of growing witch hunts. Yet, amidst this oppression, women forged clandestine networks of resistance, sharing knowledge that was both ingenious and heartbreaking. They whispered recipes for vaginal constrictives, like the Trotula's egg white paste, or tricks to time examinations with menstrual cycles, as recorded in anecdotal accounts from Aragon's courts. Some became adept at emotional masking, training themselves to remain stoic during invasive probes to avoid betraying guilt. These networks, passed through maids, sisters, and confidants, mirror resistance in other oppressed groups, like the secret codes of enslaved communities or Jewish women's survival tactics under medieval pogroms. The courage required was immense. A woman caught cheating, as in a 1420s Venetian case where a bride used animal blood, faced flogging or worse. Yet these acts persisted, a silent rebellion against a system that sought to erase their agency. The psychological aftermath was devastating. Echoing through generations, women reported disconnection from their bodies, viewing them as evidence to be managed rather than lived in. Chronicles hint at noble women avoiding intimacy, plagued by fear of future scrutiny, a trauma akin to modern accounts of ritualized abuse. The normalization was so pervasive that even religious women, like nuns tasked with examining royal brides, struggled with their roles. Some, as in a 14th century Burgundian convent record, refused to participate, facing exile for defying orders, while others rationalize their complicity as divine service, a tragic split between faith and humanity. As we approach the legacy of these practices, the enduring courage of women like Blanche, Catherine, and Joan illuminates a path toward modern resistance against bodily control. The legacy of medieval virginity testing stretches far beyond the cold stone chambers of the Middle Ages, casting long shadows into modern times where control of women's bodies remains a persistent echo of those ancient cruelties. The practices that humiliated Blanche of Navarre, Catherine of Aragon, and Joan of Arc were not relics of a bygone era, but the roots of a mindset that continues to justify bodily scrutiny in various cultures. Today, virginity testing persists in parts of Asia, the Middle East, and Northern and Southern Africa, often tied to honor codes or marriage customs, as seen in rural communities in India or among certain tribes in South Africa, where purity tests mirror medieval rituals with alarming fidelity. These practices, though modernized with medical tools, carry the same intent: to police female sexuality under the guise of tradition or morality. The World Health Organization, alongside UN Women and the UN Human Rights Council, condemned these tests in October 2018, declaring them painful, humiliating, and a form of violence against women. Yet their persistence reveals how deeply medieval attitudes about women's bodies are embedded in global cultures. The medical profession's complicity in these practices has medieval origins. The idea that women's reproductive systems are legitimate subjects for male oversight, as seen in texts like the Secretus Mulierum, laid the groundwork for centuries of gynecological control. In the United States, where virginity tests remain legal in some contexts, medical schools once taught techniques echoing those of medieval midwives, prioritizing authority over autonomy. Legal frameworks, too, bear the imprint of medieval courts. Jurisdictions in countries like Afghanistan or Egypt still permit examinations to verify chastity in legal disputes, descendants of the same procedures that scrutinized Catherine's marriage bed. These laws treat women's bodies as evidence, just as 15th century scribes recorded Blanche's examination as a political ledger entry. The psychological patterns of trauma, shame, disconnection from one's body, fear of intimacy, described by medieval women in court testimonies, mirror those reported by modern victims. A 14th century French chronicle notes a noble woman's silent weeping post-examination, a precursor to modern studies on survivors of forced medical procedures, who describe lifelong struggles with trust and self-worth. Yet, resistance also follows ancient paths. Modern activists, like medieval women sharing blood-trick secrets, build networks to challenge these practices, using social media to amplify calls for bans, much as whispered alliances once spread subversive knowledge. The UN's 2018 statement was spurred by such activism, echoing the courage of women who, centuries ago, risked punishment to defy their examiners. The stories of Blanche, Catherine, and Joan are more than historical footnotes. They are testaments to resilience against systemic violation. Blanche, trembling in 1453, survived a test that cost her dignity but not her spirit. Her survival a quiet rebellion against a system that discarded her. Catherine, defending her honor through decades of scrutiny, stood firm against Henry's might, her defiance reshaping Europe's religious landscape. Joan, facing death with unbroken faith, turned her body's scrutiny into proof of her divine mission, inspiring a nation. Their courage, forged in the crucible of cold chambers and prying hands, resonates in every modern fight for bodily autonomy, from campaigns against virginity testing to broader struggles for reproductive rights. Their suffering was not incidental but integral to a power structure that used women's bodies to maintain control. Medieval courts, churches, and scribes built a world where a hymen held more weight than a woman's humanity. Yet these women carved cracks in that edifice. Their resistance, whether through deception, defiance, or sheer endurance, inspired generations to question authority and reclaim agency. The examination rooms have crumbled, the men who ordered their violation forgotten, but the legacy of their courage endures. Blanche's trembling, Catherine's steadfastness, Joan's unyielding faith. These are not just stories of survival, but rallying cries for those who fight against injustice today, reminding us that the battle for control over one's body is as old as it is urgent.